These hills had swallowed 3 men's ambitions whole denons and held them without apology. She came alone, with a deed, a map, and a plan no one in that county had ever seen work. Beneath 20 years of silence and vine wine, something had refused to die.
She had bought the only thing no one else could see, palmed. Proof, buried under everything they had given up on.
And in the silence parred a decision.
The auction room smelled of pipe tobacco and damp wool, and the men inside spoke in the low, confident tones of people who already knew how everything would end. Willa Voss stood near the back wall with her hands folded in front of her, her chestnut hair pulled into a practical knot at the base of her neck, her blue eyes moving steadily between the auctioneer's face and the single photograph pinned to the board beside him. The photograph showed a hillside, or what had once been a hillside. Now it showed a green wall so thick and tangled that the shapes beneath it, fence posts, a barn roof, the crown of what might have been a large tree, appeared only as suggestions, the way familiar objects look when seen through river water. The auctioneer was a tall man with a red face and the unhurried manner of someone performing a task he found mildly embarrassing. He described the property in the flat language of county records: 114 acres in Tilton County, Georgia, structures present but in poor repair, access by way of the mountain road off the Dalton Pike. Soil classification on file with the county office. Minimum opening bid set at $400. No one moved. The auctioneer cleared his throat and said the minimum bid again, slower, as if the problem were hearing rather than interest. A man 2 rows ahead of Willa leaned toward his neighbor and said something she could not fully catch, though she heard the word bramble and then the word fool. His neighbor made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. Willa raised her hand. The room did not go silent all at once. It went quiet in the gradual way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens, and people are not yet certain whether to be amused or concerned. The auctioneer looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been asked a question in a language he only partially understands. He called her bid. He waited, no one countered. He waited again. The clock on the wall behind him ticked through 11 full seconds before he brought his gavel down. She walked to the front of the room, signed the necessary papers with her left hand, pressed flat against the table to keep it from trembling, and paid the full amount of $1,200 in bank draft, every dollar she had saved, across 11 years of early mornings, and late columns and figures checked twice in a counting room that smelled of ink and river damp in Savannah. She folded the deed into her coat pocket. When she turned toward the door, most of the men in the room were no longer pretending not to watch her. A heavy-set man near the window said, at full conversational volume, that she had just paid $1,200 for a pile of vines. The man beside him said that at least the vines came with a view of the mountains. This struck several people as genuinely funny. Willa did not pause. She did not look back. She pushed through the door into the gray October air of Dalton and stood on the courthouse steps, while the sounds of the room faded behind wood and glass. She had expected this. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things, not by hardening herself against the feeling, but by deciding well in advance that the feeling would not determine the next action. The next action was to collect the survey records from the county clerk's office, which closed at 4 o'clock, and she had 40 minutes. She was halfway down the steps when she heard the door open behind her. The man who came through it was built like someone who had spent his life doing work that required his whole body. Broad through the shoulders, thick in the hands, with a white beard trimmed close and gray eyebrows that gave his face a permanent expression of measured skepticism. He was perhaps 60 years old, perhaps older. The outdoors had compressed his age into something unreadable, the way sun and wind compress the grain of good wood. He wore a coat that had once been dark brown and was now the color of dried creek mud, and he moved down the steps with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had nowhere to be, but had decided to be here. He stopped beside her on the bottom step, not in front of her, beside her. He looked out toward the street the same direction she was looking, as if they had arrived at this spot for the same reason. Silas Drummond, he said. He did not extend his hand. Willa Voss. He nodded at the distant tree line, at the dark smear of the Cohutta Ridge above the town. My family has worked land in this county for 3 generations. I know that property you just purchased. I expect most people in that room do. 3 owners before you. He said it without satisfaction, the way a doctor reports a symptom. First man burned what he could reach. Took the vines about 2 seasons to reclaim everything he'd cleared. Second family hired workers with machetes and axe handles. Same result, faster. Third man paid for a steam-powered cutter from Chattanooga. The machine bogged in the slope and had to be dragged out with mules. He paused. The vines were back by the following spring. Willa looked at him for the first time directly. I appreciate you telling me that honestly. Something shifted in his expression, though it did not become warmer. More the way a locked door shifts when a key enters it, not yet open, simply engaged. He studied her face the way he might study a piece of timber he was considering for a load-bearing beam, looking for hidden cracks. What do you intend to do with it? He asked. Recover it. With what? She held his gaze. Goats to begin with. The pause that followed was brief but thorough. Silas Drummond looked at her the way a man looks at something he wants to dismiss, but cannot quite find the grounds to dismiss. He put his hat back on his head, pulled it level, and walked away down the street without another word. Willa turned and went to retrieve the survey records. She stayed in the county clerk's office until the man behind the counter began making pointed noises about the hour. She read through 3 separate survey documents, 2 plat maps, and a set of soil classification notes from 1859 that someone had filed in the wrong folder between a water rights dispute and a deed correction from 1871. The soil notes were written in a hand that pressed the pen hard into paper, as if the writer wanted to be certain someone would eventually find them and understand their importance. Deep loam. Mineral rich. Well drained to a depth of 4 feet. Former agricultural use. Mixed orchard. Tucked behind the soil notes, folded into quarters and soft at the creases from years of being pressed against other papers, was a small hand-drawn map. It showed the northern slope of the property in rough outline with hatching marks indicating elevation and a notation in smaller writing along the upper third of the slope. The writing said, Pecan Grove, North Slope, established. It gave no number of trees. It gave no date. Willa held the map under the lamp until the clerk appeared in the doorway, with his coat already on. She folded the map carefully, placed it inside her survey documents, and thanked the man, who'd stopped expecting thanks approximately 30 years earlier, and received this one without visible response. Outside, the October evening had turned cold in the direct and businesslike way that mountain air turns cold. Not gradually, not apologetically, simply all at once. She walked back to the boarding house on Thornfield Street, where she had taken a room for the week, sat at the small table by the window, and spread everything she had collected across its surface. The survey records, the soil notes, the hand-drawn map, the deed which she smoothed flat and placed at the center of the arrangement. She had bought this land not because she was reckless. She had bought it because 11 years of reading financial documents for the Second Savannah Bank of Commerce had trained her to find the sentence that other people skipped. Most people at that auction had looked at the photograph and seen the vines. Willa had read to the bottom of the file and found a soil survey from 1859 describing ground that, under the right conditions, could support almost anything with deep enough roots and enough patience to wait. She was 35 years old. Her husband Thomas had died of yellow fever in the late summer of 1878, 3 years after they married, leaving her with a small savings account, a rented house she could not afford to maintain alone, and the particular kind of silence that arrives when the person who made ordinary rooms feel inhabited is no longer in them. She had no children. She had returned to her work at the bank within a month of the funeral because there was nothing else available to her that required the same degree of concentrated attention. And concentrated attention was the only thing that reliably kept the silence at bay. She had grown up on her father's peach farm in the hill country of South Carolina. She knew how to read an orchard. She knew what deep loam meant and what it could grow. She knew the difference between land that was genuinely dead and land that was merely waiting under the wrong conditions, the way a fire waits under wet wood. The night before the auction, she had driven out to look at the property for the first time and sat in the gathering dark on the fence rail at the property boundary, watching the vine-covered hillside above her. The bramble and wild muscadine had taken everything. It rose up the slope in one continuous green mass, interrupted only by the occasional dark shape of something underneath. A fence post collapsed at an angle, the corner of a structure that had once been a barn, the crown of a large tree bent sideways under the weight of vines that had been climbing it for 20 years. It looked in the gray afternoon light like the land had made a decision to forget itself. But underneath, she had pressed her boot into the soil at the field margin and felt the give of it, the dark depth of it, the way good ground has a certain resistance that is not hardness but substance. She had taken a handful and rubbed it between her palms, and it had the color and texture that the 1859 survey described. Whatever had happened on the surface, the ground beneath had been undisturbed for decades and had spent those decades quietly becoming more of what it already was. She had made her decision before she walked back to the road. The goats arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of November, transported in 2 large wagons from a farm in eastern Tennessee, where a man named Harlan kept a breeding herd of boar crosses with the patient, proprietary pride of someone who considers himself less a farmer than a curator. He delivered 52 animals, accepted his payment with the gravity appropriate to a significant transaction, and drove away without once looking back at the animals he had left behind. They poured off the wagon ramps with the cheerful efficiency of creatures who have never worried about anything for more than 30 seconds at a time. Broad-bodied, white-flanked, brown-headed, with the calm golden eyes of animals that regard the world as primarily edible and are seldom disappointed. Within 10 minutes of arriving, 4 of them had climbed the remains of a collapsed fence section to investigate the bramble on the other side, and the sound of them pulling at the thorn canes was audible from the road. People gathered at the road. This was not unusual in Tilton County, where entertainment of any variety was treated with a seriousness that would have surprised city people. They came in ones and twos and then in small clusters, standing at the fence line or leaning against the wooden gatepost that Willa had already replaced with a new one of white oak. They watched the goats the way people watch weather, with interest and with a proprietary judgment about whether what they were seeing was going to amount to anything. A woman called out that the goats were eating the wrong fence. A man in a brown coat said the bramble would have those animals down in a season, and did she have a plan for after that? An older boy perched on a fence post announced that his uncle had tried goats and it hadn't worked, a claim he made with the confidence of someone who has never tried anything personally but has strong opinions about the failures of others. Willa was counting the animals through the temporary wooden panels she had spent 3 days setting up with borrowed posts. She made a mark in her notebook for each animal that crossed into the first paddock, reached 52, then went back and made sure the gate latch was set correctly, because the gate latch mattered more than the opinions being offered from the road. Silas Drummond was there too, though she did not see him at first. He stood apart from the others, not at the fence but further back near the tree line, where the ground rose slightly and gave a better view of the whole paddock. He was not laughing. He was not smiling. He was watching the goats work the bramble canes with an expression she would later come to recognize as his thinking face. Still, controlled, privately engaged with something he was not yet ready to say aloud. She did not wave. He did not acknowledge her. But she noted where he was standing and what his expression was, and she stored information the way she stored information that might become useful later. The first weeks established the rhythm of what her life would become, though she could not have predicted the specific texture of it in advance. She woke before daylight in the small camper she had parked against the side of the barn, a camper she had purchased secondhand in Dalton for $40. Cheap because the stove burned unreliably, and the roof had a slow leak above the east corner that she redirected with a tin can and a length of rubber tubing. She lit the stove anyway, accepted the smoke when it came, drank her coffee standing at the window, watching the dark shapes of the goats in the paddock below settle and shift in the pre-dawn cold. She fed them at first light. She checked each water trough, which froze at the edges on the colder nights and required breaking through with a hammer handle she kept beside the trough for that purpose. She walked the fence line looking for weak posts or sections where the wire had been pushed outward by an animal testing the boundary, which they did constantly, not from discontent, but from what appeared to be pure intellectual curiosity about whether the world extended past the current limit. She moved the fence. This was the core of the system she had designed, derived from everything she had read about rotational grazing and invasive plant management and the particular stubbornness of bramble root systems. She divided the property into small sections using portable wooden panels she moved by hand. The goats grazed each section until they had stripped the accessible growth. Then she moved them to the next section and began again. The bramble would regrow. She would bring the goats back. She would repeat. The roots of bramble and wild muscadine stored enormous energy underground, energy that allowed them to send up new growth even after repeated cutting or burning. The only way to exhaust that energy was to remove the growth repeatedly before it could photosynthesize its way back to full strength, season after season, until the roots ran out of reserves and gave up. It would take years. She knew this before she bought the land. She had read every document she could find on the subject, had written 2 letters to the state agricultural office in Atlanta requesting information, had received 1 reply that was helpful and 1 that was not. The timeline was not weeks or months. It was seasons repeated. She had accepted this the same way she had accepted the other terms of the arrangement. Not happily, but without illusion. In the evenings, she sat at the fold-down table in the camper with her notebooks and her lamp, and worked through the material she was still absorbing: soil chemistry, tree grafting, the life cycle of pecan production, the management requirements of a boar herd through a Georgia winter. She had grown up on her father's farm and knew the physical grammar of agricultural work, but commercial orcharding was a different vocabulary, and she was learning it the way she had learned bank accounting. Systematically, from the first principle forward, accepting that she would make errors, and that the errors were the education. Friends in Savannah wrote letters that arrived at the Dalton post office every few weeks. She answered them with brief summaries that described the work accurately and the difficulty in softer terms than the reality warranted. After sealing each envelope, she sat for a moment looking out the camper window at the dark hillside and permitted herself whatever feeling was actually present, doubt, loneliness, the specific tiredness that comes not from physical labor, but from sustained uncertainty. And then she folded that feeling away and went to sleep, because the animals needed feeding at first light, and first light was not interested in her emotional condition. The hand-drawn map stayed in her notebook. She looked at it some evenings, tracing the notation about the north slope with one finger. The location it indicated was buried so deep under bramble that she would not be able to reach it for a long time. She was not yet sure she believed what the map implied. She was certain enough to keep working. December arrived over the Cohutta Ridge on a Thursday night, without ceremony, in the form of a wind that had been building since afternoon and by 10 o'clock was pressing against the camper walls, with a weight that made the whole structure creak and shift on its blocks. Willa lay on her bunk and listened to it and calculated, the way she always calculated, running the numbers of the situation in the part of her mind that never fully stopped running numbers. Wind at this speed coming from the northwest against wooden fence panels held in place by friction and gravity, and a series of stakes driven into soil that had softened with recent rain. She was up and dressed before the first panel came down. She heard it as much as felt it, a shudder through the cold air, a sudden absence of resistance at a specific point along the east fence line, followed almost immediately by the sound of 52 goats, discovering that the boundary of their world had become flexible. Goats do not panic the way horses do. They investigate. The sound of them moving into the open ground to the east was businesslike and immediate. She took the oil lamp, pulled her coat to her throat, and went into it. The wind was the kind that makes thought difficult. It came in gusts that interrupted each stride and changed direction unpredictably, pressing cold against whatever surface it found. The lamp was mostly useless. The flame bent nearly horizontal and illuminated approximately 4 feet of ground ahead of her. She covered the east fence line first, found the section where 3 panels had gone over, and moved on. She could hear some of the animals. She followed sound when she had it, and memory of the terrain when she did not, moving through the dark the way people move through familiar land they cannot see. Less vision than intuition, the body remembering gradients and obstacles it has crossed many times in daylight. She found a cluster of 7 goats in the hollow below the east ridge and moved them back through the gap in the fence by getting behind them and letting their preference for the familiar do most of the work. She went back out. She did this 5 times. The wind did not ease. The cold became something she stopped registering as a sensation and began registering as a condition, the way you stop registering the weight of a coat you've been wearing for hours. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, she had recovered 49 animals. She had counted 4 times to be sure. 3 were gone. She searched for another hour in the early gray light, quartering the ground to the east and north, calling out and listening, finding nothing. The terrain beyond the east fence dropped away into forest, dense second-growth oak and hickory creek bottoms, ravines that were easy to enter and difficult to exit. She found tracks in a soft patch of mud near the tree line. They went in. There were no tracks coming back out. She stood at the edge of the woods for a long time. 3 animals represented money she could not replace without selling others. They represented weeks of careful management and the quiet satisfaction of watching them work the bramble canes with methodical efficiency. They represented a portion of the logic of the whole enterprise, which depended on having enough animals to cover enough ground, often enough to actually exhaust the root systems over time. Losing 3 was not catastrophic. It was not nothing. She walked the perimeter of the paddock, assessed the panels, counted the remaining 49 goats twice more, then went inside and made coffee. She had been sitting at the table for perhaps 40 minutes. Her notebook opened to a blank page she had not yet filled when she heard hoofbeats on the track outside. Silas Drummond came through the gate leading 2 goats on a rope. They were does, broad and white-sided, moving with the disgruntled competence of animals accustomed to being led somewhere they had not chosen. He tied them to the fence post outside the paddock gate and stood there looking at the repair work Willa had already done on the panels, running his eye along the wire the way experienced hands run their eyes along anything that is supposed to hold and has failed. Not with criticism, with diagnosis. Willa came out. She looked at the 2 goats. She looked at him. The corner posts on the east line are set in topsoil, he said. Up here, topsoil is only about 14 inches before you hit clay. When the ground softens, those posts have nothing to bite into. He pointed to a section of panel she had already restaked. Oak, not pine. Oak holds in clay. Pine wicks moisture and loosens. I used what I had, I know. He reached into the bed of his wagon and pulled out a bundle of oak stakes, perhaps 20 of them already sharpened. He set them against the fence post. I had these cut for a corral repair last spring. Didn't use them all. She looked at the stakes. She looked at him. Why did you bring the goats? He was quiet for a moment in the way he was often quiet. Not empty silence, but occupied silence. The kind that meant something was being considered before it was offered. Because I watched you go out 3 times last night with that lamp, he said at last. And I watched you come back in twice, with animals and once without. He looked at the paddock, where the remaining herd had resumed their morning routine with complete indifference to the events of the night. Anyone who goes out in that wind 3 times deserves 2 replacement goats. He handed her the rope. Before she could answer, he had turned back to his wagon. The east corner post, he said without looking back, wants to be set at least 18 inches if you want it to hold through spring thaw. He drove back down the track toward the county road, and the sound of the wagon wheels on the frozen ground faded into the general stillness of early morning in the Cohutta Valley. Willa stood holding the rope with 2 goats pulling at opposite ends of it and the stake bundle leaning against the fence post, and she understood, without being told in so many words, that something had just shifted between herself and the man who had spent the last 2 months watching her fail in small ways, while waiting to see whether she would continue anyway. She tied the goats to the paddock rail and went to get her post driver. The weeks that followed were cold and gray and relentlessly instructional. Every day produced something she had not accounted for in her planning. A section of fence that required a different solution than the one she had prepared for. A water trough whose drain valve corroded in the freeze and could not be closed. A doe who developed a limp that resolved on its own after 3 days, but required monitoring that cost her 2 hours each morning she had not scheduled. She adapted each time, sometimes efficiently, sometimes after a significant waste of effort, always with the feeling that the land itself was calibrating her, testing the depth of her preparation against the complexity of what actually lived here. The goats were doing their work. On the sections of hillside they had grazed repeatedly through the autumn, the bramble had thinned visibly. The canes that regrew were shorter, thinner, less vigorous than the original growth, which was exactly what the system was supposed to produce. She noted this in her records with the same care she had once applied to interest rate calculations, because the data was the argument, and she was building an argument that would take years to complete. On an afternoon in late January, she climbed to the upper edge of the north paddock, the section of hillside where the goats had made their deepest progress, grazed four times now through the autumn and into early winter. The bramble here was reduced to low, sparse regrowth, gray-brown and winter-thin, with patches of bare soil visible between the stubble. Light reached the ground for what she judged was the first time in years. The soil was dark and damp, and smelled of something rich and patient. She walked along the paddock edge, looking down through the thin growth at the ground beneath. Then she stopped, a trunk, emerging from the slope at a slight angle, the way old trees lean when they have been growing against prevailing wind for many years. The diameter was significant. She could not have reached around it with both arms, and the bark had a deep, furrowed texture she recognized from a part of her memory, older than her work at the bank, older than Savannah, that came from childhood and her father's farm and the particular way she had learned to read trees before she learned to read anything else. She pressed her palm against the bark. It was cold and solid and alive in the way that something is alive when you put your hand against it and feel what is not quite stillness. She looked up through the leafless canopy. The branch structure was there, thin in places, dead in others, but the architecture of it was intact, the major scaffold limbs present, attached, not rotted through. At the tips of several smaller branches, she could see the tight closed forms of buds waiting for warmth that was still months away. She stepped back and looked along the hillside. The bramble, thinned as it now was, revealed the shapes of other trunks further up the slope, similar in character to the one before her, similar in the furrowed bark, the diameter, the angular lean of old growth. She did not count them yet. She needed better light and a cleared path, and the kind of careful attention that cannot be applied at the end of a long day in failing light. She pulled the hand-drawn map from her coat pocket she had taken to carrying it, unfolded it, held it level with the slope, and compared what she was seeing to what the notation described. The notation said north slope. She was on the north slope. She folded the map and put it away. The cold was settling into the valley below, the light going the particular gray gold of winter late afternoon in the mountains. The goats in the lower paddock made their ordinary sounds in the distance, untroubled by significance. Willa stood at the edge of the cleared ground for another few minutes, her hands still resting against the old bark, thinking about what it means when something survives, not because conditions favored it, but simply because it refused to stop. Then she turned and walked down the hill to break the ice on the water troughs before dark. That night she sat at the camper table with her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Below it, she wrote a single line and underlined it. Then she opened her accounts ledger and spent 2 hours doing figures she already knew would not be comfortable, because the money she had saved across 11 years in Savannah was disappearing at a rate that had not slackened, and what she had seen on the north hillside that afternoon was still months of hard seasons in, away from becoming anything she could describe to a bank officer in Dalton as collateral. She closed the ledger. She looked at the folded map on the table beside it. She looked at the lines she had underlined in her notebook, which said only, North Slope, confirmed. Outside the camper window, The Cohutta Ridge had disappeared into cloud, and the cold pressed against the thin walls with the patience of something that has all winter and knows it. Willa turned down the lamp and went to sleep, because first light was coming whether or not she was ready for it, and in her experience, first light had never once waited. February came to the Cohutta Valley the way debt comes, quietly at first, then with a weight that made itself known in everything. The cold settled into the ground, into the joints of fence panels, into the thin walls of the camper where Willa woke each morning to find the water in her wash basin skinned with ice. She broke it with the same hammer handle she used on the troughs and went about her work without ceremony, because ceremony required time she did not have. The accounts ledger said the same thing in different configurations of the same numbers every evening she opened it. She had entered February with enough reserve to carry the operation through to late spring, provided nothing unexpected required significant expenditure. In agricultural work, this provision was roughly equivalent to hoping the weather would have the decency to behave, a reasonable wish and an unreliable one. The feed bill for supplementing the herd through winter came to more than she had projected, because the bramble went fully dormant in a cold snap in mid-January and provided nothing the animals could browse, which meant purchased hay for 6 weeks instead of the 4 she had planned. The hay in Tilton County that winter was priced at a rate that reflected its scarcity. She paid what was asked. She had no alternative. By the first week of February, she had done the arithmetic enough times to trust the conclusion it kept producing. She needed capital she did not have. The work she was doing on the property would eventually produce value, but eventually was not a figure that appeared in the current column of a ledger, and the current column was where her problems lived. She drove the wagon into Dalton on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the particular flat white of clouds that cannot decide whether to snow. The Commercial Bank of Tilton County occupied a building on the main street constructed to project permanence, heavy stone facing, tall windows, brass fittings polished to a brightness that seemed to reflect light from somewhere other than the gray February sky. The man behind the loan officer's desk was named Harold Fitch. He was perhaps 55, with the careful grooming of someone who considers his appearance a professional instrument, and he listened to Willa's presentation with the expression of a man performing a courtesy he has already privately concluded will not change his position. She had prepared carefully current asset values, projected income from grazing services, timeline to first commercial production, the soil survey data from 1859 that established the underlying quality of the land beneath its present condition. Fitch let her finish. He tapped one finger against the edge of her documents, a small rhythmic gesture that suggested he was waiting for her to stop rather than listening to what she was saying. Mrs. Voss. He set the soil survey aside without reading it. The property in question is currently assessed at $420 by the county. Your herd represents the majority of your remaining liquid assets. I cannot extend operating credit against a security position of this nature. The assessment reflects surface conditions that are actively being remediated. She kept her voice level. The underlying soil value is prospective. He folded his hands. The bank extends credit against present value, not future potential. What you're describing is a project that may produce returns in some years. That is not the same as collateral. She gathered her documents, thanked him, because thanking people who refused you was a habit she had developed at the bank and had never found a reason to abandon. It cost nothing, revealed nothing, and occasionally produced useful information in the form of what people said after they believed the conversation was finished, and walked out. What Fitch said to the clerk who appeared in the doorway as Willa was leaving was not useful information. It was simply what men said in that county in that year when a woman walked out of a professional office having failed to obtain what she came for. She did not turn around. She stood on the sidewalk in the flat white February cold for a time that was probably shorter than it felt. She let herself feel the full weight of what the ledger was going to look like when she returned to it that evening. She had learned over years of working with other people's financial difficulties that there was a cost to refusing to look at a problem clearly, and the cost was always higher than the problem itself. She looked at it clearly. She was approximately 4 months from the point at which she would need to begin making decisions she did not want to make. She could extend that margin by reducing the herd, selling animals she had planned to keep, shrinking the operation below the scale her grazing system required to function properly. Walking back to the livery where she had left the wagon, she passed the office of a commission buyer who handled agricultural products across 3 counties. She did not stop. She had nothing to sell that would interest a produce buyer, and she preferred not to introduce herself to potential business relationships from a position of visible desperation. She drove back to the property, spent the afternoon doing calculations she had already done, looking for margin she had already confirmed was not there. Then she put the ledger away and went out to check the fence line. Because the fence line was solvable in a way the ledger currently was not, and she had found over the past months that the best response to unsolvable problems was to solve something adjacent to them and maintain momentum. The decision she made that night was the kind that looks small from the outside and is not small at all from the inside. She would sell 8 animals, the 8 youngest does from the original herd, before they reached breeding age, when their value was highest relative to their cost to maintain. The sale would provide enough reserve to carry the operation through spring without reducing the core grazing capacity below functional threshold. It would also mean the growth of the herd she had planned for this year would not happen, that the breeding stock she had been building toward would be set back by at least 1 season, that the system she had designed would run closer to its minimum viable size for longer than she had wanted. She wrote it in the ledger as a line item, closed it, and went to sleep. She sold the animals the following week to a farm outside Resaca, whose owner had heard, through the particular invisible network by which agricultural information traveled in that county, that the woman at the Voss Ridge property kept clean, well-managed boer crosses. The transaction was straightforward and fair and left her with enough room to breathe, which was all she had asked of it. Spring came late to the Cohutta elevations, later than the almanac suggested and later than Willa's plans had assumed, which was characteristic of mountain spring. It arrived on its own schedule with no interest in anyone else's projections. The bramble began putting up new growth in the 3rd week of March, thin green shoots emerging from the cut cane stumps and root crowns with the dogged persistence that had made it impossible to eradicate by any faster method. The goats went back to work. The sound of them moving through the paddocks in the early morning, pulling at canes, returned something to the rhythm of the days that had been missing through the worst of the winter. It was in the 1st week of April, on a morning that was still cold, but carried in it the specific quality of cold that is finishing rather than deepening, that a wagon Willa did not recognize came up the track from the county road. The man driving it was large in the way that suggested size had always been his natural condition, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face tanned to the deep, permanent color of someone who has spent most of his decades outdoors. His hair was silver at the edges beneath a worn cloth cap pulled low against the morning chill, and he wore a reddish-gray beard left to grow to a functional rather than ornamental length. He handled the reins with the minimal attention of someone for whom driving was so habitual it required approximately the same conscious effort as breathing. He pulled up near the gate and looked at the paddock where a section of the herd was working a slope that had been dense with bramble the previous autumn and was now visibly reduced. The canes sparse enough that the ground between them was clearly visible. Willa came out of the barn where she had been repairing a panel hinge. She still had the wrench in her hand. He looked at her, then back at the paddock. "Fletcher Mabry. I run cattle on 300 acres up near the Tennessee line." He studied the slope for another moment. "Heard you were doing something unusual with goats and vines." "You heard right." He pointed at the paddock. "That's after how long?" "That section, 7 months of repeated grazing. 4 passes through the season." He was quiet in a calculating way, not the way of someone who had nothing to say, but the way of someone adding figures. "I've got a southeast-facing hillside, about 40 acres. Muscadine and blackberry have been coming in for 6 years. My cutting crew can't keep pace with regrowth. They won't." She kept the wrench at her side, not as a gesture but because she had simply not yet set it down. Cutting stimulates lateral growth. You remove the cane and the root sends up 2 more. He looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly, still assessing, but in a different direction. "What would your animals do to it?" "Depends on how you define done." She walked to the fence rail and leaned against it, facing the slope. "In 1 season, they'll reduce new growth enough that your cattle can access the grazing underneath. In 3 seasons, the root systems in the worst sections will begin to exhaust. In 5 years, the hillside will be manageable without continued intervention, assuming you maintain a rotation. That's a long commitment. I'm not selling you a commitment. I'm telling you what the biology does." Fletcher Mabry looked at the hillside for a long time. A sound came from the far paddock, the easy, purposeful tearing of animals at work, regular as a clock. "What do you charge per month?" She gave him a figure she had been calculating since she first saw him come through the gate. Not low enough to suggest desperation, not high enough to give him a reason to look elsewhere. He did not negotiate. She had read him correctly as a man who made decisions once and did not enjoy revisiting them. They shook hands at the gate. He drove away. Willa went back to the barn and finished the hinge repair and allowed herself, in the privacy of the empty barn, a single moment of something adjacent to relief. Not triumph, not vindication, simply the particular quality of tension releasing when a load held a long time is finally set down. She wrote the agreement into the ledger that evening. It was not enough to change everything. It was enough to extend the margin, to buy more of the thing the whole enterprise depended on, which was time. Fletcher Mabry brought 2 more clients before summer. He did not do this as a favor. He did it because both men had seen his hillside in June and asked who was responsible, and he told them, because the results were visible, and he was not in the habit of keeping useful information from people he respected. The arrangement expanded into something that began to look, if not yet like a business, then like the beginning of one. A network of properties across 3 counties where portions of her herd worked on rotating schedules, while the remaining animals continued the long work on her own land. The days became something she could not have described to her former self in Savannah, physically harder than anything she had previously done, financially tighter than she had planned for, emotionally stripped of most of the comfortable insulations that city professional life provided. She went to sleep tired in a way that had texture to it, specific and honest, and she woke to work that was the direct continuation of the previous day's work, with no interval of abstraction between the effort and its purpose. She did not think about this as freedom, which would have been imprecise and sentimental. She thought about it as alignment, the condition of a life in which the thing being built and the daily cost of building it are the same thing, with no gap between them. Dorothea Greer arrived on a Thursday in early June when the morning fog was still lifting off the valley below. Willa was on the north slope making her regular survey of the upper paddock, where the herd had now made sufficient progress that she was beginning to see the ground clearly for the first time. Not just glimpses through thin canes, but actual exposed soil, damp and dark, with the first hesitant growth of native grasses appearing in the patches where sunlight now reached. She heard the wagon on the track and came down the slope to find a woman of perhaps 42 standing outside the gate, looking up toward the north hillside with the focused attention of someone who is not sightseeing. She had dark blonde hair pushed under a faded canvas hat that had been rained on, and dried enough times that it had taken a shape of its own. Her eyes were a warm brown that caught detail the way a good lens catches light, not missing much, not making much of what they noticed. Her skin was tanned and lightly freckled in the way of someone who has spent most of her adult life outdoors. "Dorothea Greer," she said without preamble. "I run the Greer Nursery outside Dalton. Fruit and nut trees, mostly. My father started it. I rebuilt it after the flood of '74 took half our stock." Willa waited. "I heard there might be old pecan stock on this property." Dorothea was still looking at the north hillside. "Heard it from Owen Calloway's son, who heard it from someone in the county records office, who apparently saw you go through the old survey files last October." She looked at Willa directly. "I'd like to see them, if they're accessible." Here was something Willa had not expected, not the interest, which she had begun to anticipate from various quarters as the work on the property became more visible, but the directness of it. Dorothea Greer had not arrived with a gift or a pleasantry or a polite pretense of neighborly curiosity. She had arrived because she wanted something specific, and she had said so without apology. "They're accessible," Willa said. "Follow me." They climbed the north slope together. Dorothea did not speak during the climb, which Willa noted as evidence of someone who understood that observation and conversation are competing activities and was choosing the more useful one. When they reached the section where the large trunks were visible, Willa had cleared enough bramble by hand in this area over the previous weeks to expose them more fully. Dorothea slowed and began looking with the particular deliberateness of professional examination. She moved from trunk to trunk. She pressed her fingers into the bark furrows. She looked up through the branch structure of each tree, moving her head slowly to follow the major scaffold limbs. She crouched at the base of 2 different trees and scraped at the soil with a small knife she produced from her coat pocket, looking at the root flare and the condition of the bark at ground level. She said nothing for a long time. 12, she said at last. "There are 12 with viable canopy structure. That one," she indicated a tree at the upper edge of the group, "has significant dieback on the west scaffold, but the east side is sound. I counted 12 as well." Dorothea turned and looked back down the slope toward the valley, working through something in her mind she had not yet offered aloud. "These trees are old. 40 years minimum, probably closer to 60, judging by the trunk diameter and the bark development. They've been under vine pressure for 20 or more years. That they're alive at all is." She paused, searching for the right word, and settled on one that was less dramatic than several alternatives she had apparently considered. "Unusual." "I thought so. What's your plan for them?" Willa looked at the trees. She had been asking herself this question in various forms since January. Since the night she had stood at the edge of the north paddock, in the January dark, with her hand against the bark of the largest trunk, and understood she was touching something that had survived on its own terms. "I need a proper soil assessment first, and a professional opinion on whether the trees themselves can be returned to production." Dorothea turned back to her. Something in her expression had shifted, not softened, but engaged in a different way. "The county extension office has someone for that. Owen Calloway. Not Calloway's son, his father. He's the one who actually knows what he's doing." She pulled a notebook from her coat pocket and wrote a name and a post office box. "Tell him Dorothea sent you. He'll come faster." She tore the page out and handed it to Willa. Then she looked back at the trees one more time. "I want to be honest with you about why I'm here, Mrs. Voss. I'm not here out of general interest. Old pecan stock from the Cohutta elevations. If it's producing and healthy, represents a seed source I don't have access to anywhere else. The mountain varieties have characteristics you won't find in the lowland cultivars I typically work with. She met Willa's eyes without apology. If these trees can be brought back, and if you develop the orchard further, I want to be the nursery you work with. You're proposing a business relationship. I am. Willa looked at the paper with Calloway's name on it. Get him up here first. Then we'll know what we're proposing a business relationship about. Dorothea Greer nodded once, with the expression of a woman who respects a conditional answer more than an easy one. They walked back down the slope together, and at the gate Dorothea turned her wagon in the narrow lane with practiced efficiency and drove away toward Dalton. Willa stood at the gate a moment longer, looking up at the north hillside. Then she went inside and wrote a letter to the post office box Dorothea had given her. Dr. Owen Calloway arrived 3 weeks later in an aging wagon whose bed was organized with the specific experience clutter for someone who spends most of his professional life in the field. Soil probes and sampling tubes in one section, reference materials in another, a collection of small glass jars for specimens, a hand-level, measuring tapes, a portable scale, several notebooks held together with a length of cord. He was 49, lean in the way of people who walk a great deal, with the kind of face that outdoors makes ageless in middle age. Brown, angular, framed by dark hair going silver at the temples, and a beard trimmed with attention but not vanity. He shook her hand at the gate, his grip brief and direct. Calloway. Dorothea said you had something worth looking at. He spent the better part of the day on the property. He worked methodically and without apparent hurry, which Willa recognized as the particular efficiency of someone who has learned that thoroughness takes exactly as long as thoroughness takes, and that rushing it costs more time than it saves. She stayed with him through the morning, answering his questions when he asked, which was not frequently, and each time he asked he was looking at something specific rather than making conversation. In the afternoon she left him to his work and went to manage the herd rotation, checking in at intervals to find him at different points on the slope, always doing something precise. He came down at 4 o'clock, when the light was going golden over the ridge. She had made coffee and poured 2 cups, and he took his and stood looking at the north hillside from the lower gate with the same focused expression she had seen on him all day, now turned toward synthesis rather than observation. He drank half the coffee before he said anything. You have 12 trees with living canopy structure. Dorothea was right about that, and she's not usually wrong about trees. What she may not have told you. He pulled one of his notebooks from his coat and opened it to a page of figures. Is that 3 of the 12 have root compromise that is going to limit their recovery. Not terminal, but they will never produce at the level the other 9 can. So 9 at full capacity, 3 at reduced. Over time, yes, it will take 2 full growing seasons of proper nutrition, pruning management, and consistent moisture before you'll see meaningful nut production from any of them. He turned to what Willa could see he considered more important, the soil. He handed her the notebook, opened to a page of numbers she could read because she had spent the winter educating herself in exactly this. Deep loam consistent with the 1859 survey. What the survey didn't have the methodology to fully describe is the mineral profile. Your north and northwest slopes have an unusual concentration of calcium and magnesium in the subsoil layer. Pecan production depends heavily on both. You have them in natural abundance at precisely the depth where mature pecan roots forage. She looked at the numbers. The vines didn't deplete it. Bramble and muscadine are shallow-rooted. They took what they needed from the top 8 inches and left everything below undisturbed. 20 years of leaf drop from the vines added organic matter back into the surface layer. He took back the notebook and closed it. Mrs. Voss, I'm going to tell you something I want you to receive carefully, because I've watched people hear this kind of news and make decisions based on the hearing rather than the work that follows. He looked at her directly. You have the right land for an orchard. The conditions here are genuinely favorable. Not marginally favorable, genuinely. But the trees you have now are starting points, not an answer. You will need to improve drainage in 2 sections, address the pH differential on the east slope, and install irrigation before you bring in young stock, or you will lose a percentage of whatever you plant that will cost you more than the improvement work. How long before I can plant? 2 seasons of preparation. If you start immediately, you can plant in the spring of '84. 2 more years of outlay before the first tree went into the ground. She had known something like this was likely. Calloway had not told her anything she had not already suspected from her reading. But there is a difference between suspecting a number and having a careful man tell you the number while looking you in the eye. And she sat with that difference for a moment before she spoke again. The 9 trees at full capacity, properly managed. What is a realistic production estimate at maturity? He gave her a figure. It was modest by the standard of established commercial orchards. It was more than she had let herself hope for when she had been standing in February cold, Outside the commercial bank, calculating margins on a property, a loan officer had valued at $420. And grafted stock added over 5 years? He gave her another figure, with appropriate qualifications about variety selection and mortality rates and market conditions he could not predict. Even with the qualifications, the number described a different future than the one she had been managing toward all winter. She handed back his coffee cup. "I'd like your written assessment when you have time to prepare it, and your recommendation on variety selection when we're closer to planning." He said he would have both, packed his equipment into the wagon with the same organized efficiency he had arrived with, and drove back down the track toward the county road. The evening that followed was long. She sat outside the camper on an overturned feed bucket as the last light left the Cohutta Ridge, and she did not open the ledger, and she did not make calculations. She had spent enough of the winter inside numbers. What Calloway had told her required a different kind of processing, not the addition and subtraction of the ledger, but the slower, harder work of allowing something to become real. She had bought this land because she had read a sentence in a survey file that other people had skipped. She had come here expecting to clear invasive growth and recover whatever value the soil retained. She could admit this to herself now, in the specific honesty that the quiet mountain evening permitted. She had not genuinely expected the 12 trees. She had carried the hand-drawn map in her coat pocket for 7 months as a kind of private hypothesis, something she held on to not because she was certain, but because certainty had not been required for the next step. Now the hypothesis had a soil profile behind it, and the word of a man who had spent 20 years recovering orchards other people had written off. The temperature dropped as the sky cleared, the stars appearing over the ridge in the particular abundance that only shows itself at elevation, away from the light of towns. She went inside, lit the lamp, and opened a fresh page in the notebook. Not the ledger, the other one, the one with the hand-drawn map folded inside the front cover. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Below it, she wrote Calloway's production estimates, the soil numbers, the timeline, the list of preparation work he had specified. She wrote all of it in the clear, ordered hand she had developed across 11 years of bank accounting, because writing a thing precisely was how she committed to taking it seriously. At the bottom of the page, below the figures, she wrote 4 words she had not planned to write and recognized, as she wrote them, as the first honest statement she had made about what she was actually doing here, beyond the practical language of soil surveys and herd management and operating margins. She wrote, "Build something that lasts." She closed the notebook, turned down the lamp, and went to sleep with the weight of a larger plan settling around her. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, simply present, the way the mountains were present, the way the 9 living trees on the north slope were present in the dark above her, patient as everything that is already decided to survive. The summer that followed was the first one that felt like momentum rather than endurance. The grazing contracts with Fletcher Mabry's neighbors had stabilized into a reliable pattern. 3 properties in 2 counties ran portions of her herd on rotating schedules that she managed from a handwritten calendar pinned to the camper wall, color-coded by property in a system she had developed over the winter. The calendar was the most complicated document in the camper, more complicated than the ledger, which was beginning to look less like a record of things disappearing and more like the record of an operation with actual mechanics. She sold her first young breeding stock in July, 6 males and 4 females from the Springs kids, to 2 different farms who had heard about the herd's productivity through the same invisible network that had brought Fletcher Mabry to her gate in April. The prices she received were not remarkable. They represented the beginning of a reputation, which was the thing that would eventually allow her to charge more, and reputations were built on exactly this kind of unremarkable beginning. She started the drainage work on the North Slope in August, hiring 2 men from the valley below, who came recommended by Silas Drummond without his ever quite saying he was recommending them. He simply mentioned their names in the context of a conversation about drainage, and when she hired them and they did the work correctly and on schedule, she understood that the recommendation had been implicit in the mention. This was how Silas communicated useful information, through proximity rather than direct statement, the way a current in a river reveals itself by what floats in it. The work was hard and slow. Digging drainage channels by hand on a slope in August heat, moving rock and cutting root systems, installing the tile drains Calloway had specified in positions he had marked on a hand-drawn diagram he had mailed her in June. She worked alongside the 2 hired men rather than supervising from a distance because the work went faster with 3 pairs of hands, and she learned things from doing it that she would not have learned from watching. By September, the North Slope was beginning to look less like a recovery project and more like preparation for something. The bramble in the upper section had been reduced by repeated grazing to sparse, low regrowth that she now managed manually between grazing rotations, cutting back new shoots before they could establish. The soil where the canes had once formed an impenetrable wall was dark and open to the air, and beginning, in the areas with the most sun exposure, to show the hesitant first growth of native grasses returning from seed stocks that had waited underground through decades of vine dominance. It was in the third week of September, at the end of a day that had started at 5 in the morning with a sick animal and included 4 hours of fence repair and a disagreement with a hardware supplier in Dalton about the quality of wire he had sold her, that she came back up the track and found Silas Drummond's wagon at the gate. He was standing at the fence rail on the track side, looking up at the north slope in the late afternoon light. The cleared sections were visible from where he stood, the thinned bramble, the drainage channels integrated into the grade, the 12 old trees standing in their irregular line across the upper hillside, their canopies catching the September gold. She pulled the wagon up beside his and climbed down. They stood at the fence rail together, looking up the slope. "Your drainage work shows," he said. "You can see where the water is moving correctly now. The grade looks right." Calloway specified it. Calloway knows drainage. He was quiet for a moment. "Those trees," he said, indicating the upper hillside with his chin. "How many are producing?" "None yet. They need 2 more seasons of recovery management. Spring of '84 for the first new plantings around them." He nodded slowly. In the paddock below the slope, a portion of the herd was settling toward evening, their sounds carrying clearly in the cooling air. He watched them with the expression she had come to read as something between acknowledgement and recalibration. Silas Drummond updating his position on something he had previously held differently. "My father's father ran cattle on the land north of here," he said. It was not a non sequitur, though it arrived like one. He used to say this whole valley was better farmland than people gave it credit for. Said the elevation was what kept people from seeing it right. They looked at the difficulty of the terrain and stopped looking at the soil. She waited. "I thought he was wrong." He looked at the north slope one more time. "I thought he meant the cattle ground. But maybe he was looking further than that." It was the closest Silas Drummond had come in 2 years of knowing her to saying that what she was doing might have been worth doing. She understood that it was as direct a statement as he was equipped to make, and she received it accordingly. One afternoon that October, she drove to Dalton to collect supplies and, on her way out of town, stopped at a commission buyer's office on the main street. She had a sample, not much, a small sack of husk material from the old pecan trees, not the nut itself, which was not yet ready, but the material from which quality could be assessed by someone who knew what to look for. The buyer was a lean man named Pruitt, who had been purchasing agricultural product across 3 counties for long enough that he assessed material without drama, the way a doctor takes a pulse. He turned the husk material over in his hands and looked at Willa. "This is from the Cohutta elevations. North slope. Old stock, probably 60 years in ground." He examined it again. "When will you have the nut?" "Next season." "Small quantity. The trees are still in recovery." Pruitt set the material down and made a note in his own ledger. "There are buyers in Chattanooga who've been looking for mountain elevation pecans for several years. The lowland varieties don't have the flavor profile they want." He looked at her over the ledger. "What quantity are you projecting long term?" She gave him the figures Calloway had provided, with the same qualifications Calloway had attached. Pruitt wrote for a moment. "When you have product, come back." He tore a page from his ledger and slid it across the counter. "A buyer's direct address in Chattanooga. Tell him Pruitt sent you." She walked back to her wagon with the paper folded in her coat pocket next to the hand-drawn map that had been there since October of 1881. 2 pieces of paper from 2 different years, pointing in the same direction. The drive back up the mountain track in the October dusk was one she had made hundreds of times now, and the land on either side of it had become as familiar as anything she had ever known. The way the track curved at the lower creek crossing, the stands of oak that marked the property boundary. The first sight of the north hillside coming into view above the lower gate, the old trees on the upper slope visible as dark shapes against the sky, where the canes had once been solid green all the way to the summit. She pulled through the gate and stopped the wagon and sat for a moment with the reins loose in her hands, looking up at the hillside in the last light. The trees were there. The ground beneath them was there. Everything she had come here to find had been here the entire time, not waiting for her specifically, but simply continuing in the dark under the vines, the way things that are genuinely rooted continue, indifferent to the conditions on the surface, sustained by what is below. She climbed down, unhitched the horse, and went inside to update the ledger with what the evening had produced. The spring of 1884 arrived with the particular decisiveness of a season that has been delayed too long and is making up for lost time. The dogwoods on the lower slopes opened within a week of each other, and the soil on the north hillside, which had spent the winter in a state of improved but untested readiness, revealed itself in April to be everything the drainage work and the soil amendments had promised. Dark, friable, retaining moisture, without holding it, alive with the specific smell of ground that has been properly prepared for something. The 80 grafted trees arrived from Dorothea Greer's nursery on a wagon driven by one of her workers, a quiet man named Thaddeus, who handled the bald rootstock with the deliberate care of someone who has been very precisely instructed. Each tree was wrapped at the root ball in burlap and tied with cord, and each one had a small tag marking its variety. Willa had worked with Dorothea through the previous winter to select grafted cultivars suited to elevation, to the specific mineral profile Callaway had documented, to the commercial market Pruitt had outlined in his connection to the Chattanooga buyers. She had ordered 80. She had the money for 80, and not comfortably. Thaddeus helped her unload. When the last tree was on the ground and he was preparing to drive the empty wagon back down to Dalton, he looked at the prepared ground. At the staked positions she had already marked with small flags along the upper slope, at the distance between the flags reflecting the mature canopy spread, Callaway had specified, and his expression carried something that was not quite skepticism and not quite wonder, but occupied a point between them. Only 80, he said, not as a question. To start, he drove away. Willa picked up the first tree by its root ball and carried it to the first stake. She planted all 80 trees herself over 3 days, working from first light until the light failed. The technique mattered, and she had practiced it in her mind many times before she did it with her hands. Depth of hole, position of root ball, backfill composition, the amount of water required to settle the soil without compacting it, the placement of the protective wooden collar around each young trunk to keep deer browse and late frost from undoing in a night what the planting had established. She did not rush. She did not skip steps. She had not spent 2.5 years preparing this ground to lose trees to impatience. On the afternoon of the third day, with the last tree planted and the last collar secured, she stood at the upper edge of the planting area and looked down the slope. 80 small trees, each one no taller than her shoulder, each one marked by a collar of split wood, ran in irregular rows across the hillside below her. Behind them and above them, the 9 old trees stood in their long-established positions, their canopies just beginning to push out new leaf growth in the April warmth. The proportion was laughable if you were looking for quick results. 80 small trees on a slope that could eventually carry 3 times that number. 9 old trees that would not produce meaningfully for another season. Willa looked at it for the length of time it took to absorb the reality of the work that remained. Then she picked up her tools and went to check on the herd. Fletcher Mabry appeared at the gate 2 weeks into May with 2 men she had not seen before, both cattle producers from properties to the north and west of Mabry's land, both with the contained, assessing quality of men who have been told something is worth seeing and are prepared to be unimpressed. Fletcher introduced them without elaboration and then stood back, in the way that people stand back when they have done their part and are waiting to see what happens next. Willa took them up to the east paddock, which had been grazed 6 times now over 2.5 years and had transformed to the degree that it looked, on casual inspection, like a section of ordinary cleared pasture. The transformation was the point. The bramble that had covered this ground to head height when she arrived had been reduced to occasional low shoots she could manage manually without difficulty, and the native grass that had come in behind it was dense enough that cattle could have worked it productively. One of the men, a broad, laconic producer named Alderman, whose family had ranched the Cohutta foothills since before the war, crouched at the edge of the grass and pulled a handful up by the roots. He looked at the soil clinging to them. He pressed it between his fingers. "What does it cost?" Alderman said, still looking at the soil. She gave him the monthly rate. He released the grass, stood up, looked across the paddock once, and told her to expect his wagon in June with the first group of animals. He did not negotiate, and he did not ask further questions, which was how serious producers made decisions in her experience. The information was either sufficient or it was not, and if it was sufficient, the conversation was already over. The second man, younger, more talkative, wanted to know whether the system worked on slopes steeper than the ones she had. She told him the answer depended on the specific terrain, and offered to come look at his land before they agreed on anything. He looked surprised at this, which told her he had expected either a blanket yes or an explanation he could dismiss. She had learned that offering to actually look at a problem before agreeing to solve it confused people who were accustomed to being sold things by people who hadn't looked at anything. He hired her as well, and she did go look at his land first and found 2 sections where her system would work efficiently and 1 section where it would not, and she told him exactly that, which built something between them that a more accommodating answer would not have. By midsummer, the operation had expanded to 6 properties across 3 counties. The ledger, which had spent 2 years recording a careful, grinding retreat from solvency, now recorded consistent flow, the kind of monthly arithmetic that allows you to plan rather than simply manage. She hired a young man from the valley below, the son of one of the drainage workers from the previous summer, to help manage the herd rotations across the expanded network of properties. His name was Corbin, and he was 17 and capable in the specific unteachable way of people who understand animals without having learned to understand them. Intuitively, physically, through the same kind of body knowledge that lets a good horseman feel the shift of an animal before it occurs. She paid him fairly and told him why the work was done the way it was done, rather than simply requiring him to do it. Because she had found that people who understood the reason for a system maintained it more reliably than people who simply followed instructions. Calloway came back in August, unannounced, which was characteristic of him. She found him on the north slope, standing at the base of one of the 9 old trees with his hand on the bark, looking up into the canopy with the expression of a man checking the progress of something he had invested professional credibility in. The tree had leafed out fully by then, the canopy thicker than it had been the previous summer, the new growth at the branch tips extending further than Calloway had initially projected. "Ahead of where I expected," he said when she climbed up to where he stood. He moved to the next tree without preamble, and she walked with him while he looked at each one in turn. At the 6th tree, he stopped longer than he had stopped at the others. His hand went to a branch junction where she had noticed, the previous week, an unusual density of new growth. He bent the branch slightly and looked at where it joined the main scaffold. "This tree is going to produce this season," he said. "Not a commercial quantity, but more than I projected for this year." She looked at the branch junction. The tiny closed forms she had been monitoring for weeks resolved suddenly into what they actually were. Not buds, but the earliest stage of fruit development, so small that she had told herself not to assume, had held the hope at a careful distance until someone who knew more than she did confirmed it. Calloway let the branch return to its position. "The other 3 in the upper group will likely follow next season, the remaining 5 2 years more." He made a note. "Your new plantings are establishing well. Mortality so far?" 3. 2 from late frost damage in May. 1 I cannot explain. 3 out of 80 is acceptable. Better than acceptable. He made another note. "What's your next planting plan?" She had already worked it out with Dorothea. 120 trees next spring. "The section east of the drainage channel is ready. I want the varieties split differently from this planting. More weight toward the longer season cultivars that Pruitt indicated the Chattanooga buyers prefer." Calloway looked down the slope at the 80 young trees in their collars, then up at the old trees, then out at the valley. "You're building a different thing than most people who come into this county with money and a plan," he said. There was no particular warmth in how he said it. It was an observation, precise and impersonal. "Most people build toward a first return. You're building toward a structure that compounds." She had heard variations of this comment before, always with a slight edge of surprise, as if the approach were unexpected. Building toward a first return meant building something you would have to rebuild constantly. It had always seemed to her the more exhausting option. The frost came in the 3rd week of September that year, earlier than the almanac had suggested, and it came hard. Not the soft advisory frost of early autumn that darkens squash leaves and reminds farmers to pay attention, but the serious, killing cold that arrives in the night and by morning has destroyed everything that was not prepared for it. Willa was up at 2 in the morning when the temperature dropped in the way she had learned to read from 2 years of watching how the valley air moved. A stillness first, then a specific quality of cold that had weight rather than simply temperature. She and Corbin spent 3 hours covering the most vulnerable of the new plantings, with burlap she kept in the barn for exactly this purpose, working by lantern light up and down the slope, the cold pressing through their coats. The old trees needed no protection. They were deep-rooted and hardened, decades past the fragility that threatened the young stock. When the light came up and the frost revealed itself across the valley in the gray-white way it does in the mountains, every leaf edged, every blade of grass stiffened. Willa walked the planting rows, removing the burlap to assess what they had saved and what they had not. 11 trees were gone. The frost had found the ones on the northeast exposure of the east section, where the cold air pooled on still nights. 11 trees added to the 3 she had already lost made 14 out of 80. A percentage within the acceptable range. Calloway had described, but not easy to look at on a cold September morning, with the evidence of the work that would need repeating in front of her. Corbin stood beside her at the edge of the northeast section, looking at the blackened foliage on the lost trees. He was not given to expressing things directly and did not now. He just looked. "Next year, that section gets wind protection on the uphill side before planting," she said. "We'll add a hedgerow. Corbin, make a note to order hawthorn stock from Dorothea in January." He made a note. They pulled the dead trees and moved on. She wrote to Dorothea that evening about the losses and received in reply a letter that was practical and brief and included a precise accounting of what replaced stock would cost in the spring and what could be held back from the following year's nursery order to offset it. The letter contained at its end a single line that was not practical or brief. "I have lost more than 11 trees to a frost and rebuilt the next season regardless. So will you." It was the most personal thing Dorothea Greer had written to her in 2 years of correspondence, and Willa read it twice before filing it. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the first winter in which the operation sustained itself without requiring decisions she did not want to make. The grazing contracts provided consistent income through the months when the orchard required input without yet providing return. She had arrived at something she recognized from her banking years, not profitability in the ambitious sense, but the operational stability that allows the next step to be chosen rather than forced. She planted 120 trees in the spring of 1885, as planned. The northeast section got the hawthorn hedgerow first, installed in March before the planting, set close enough that within a few seasons it would form the wind barrier the terrain required. She staggered the planting dates across 2 weeks, which meant that if another early frost arrived, it would not find all the new growth at the same stage of vulnerability simultaneously. Corbin had grown into the work in a way that went beyond the basic competence she had initially required of him. He had developed his own relationships with the farmers on the contract properties, had learned which sections of each property needed attention before she needed to tell him, had begun keeping his own notes on animal behavior and pasture condition in a small notebook he carried in his shirt pocket. She gave him more responsibility and commensurate pay and watched him grow into both, with the quiet satisfaction of watching a well-made thing do what it was designed to do. Silas Drummond came to the North Slope for the first time that spring. He came alone on foot on a Tuesday morning in April when Willa was working the upper planting area with Corbin. She saw him coming up the slope from the lower gate. He moved more slowly than he had moved 2 years ago, the winter having taken something from his stride that had not yet returned, and she waited at the upper fence line. He came to where she stood and looked across the planting area without speaking. The 1884 trees were leafing out on their second spring, the protective collars giving way to actual growth that overtopped their ends. The 9 old trees above them stood fully in bud, the one Callaway had predicted would produce carrying a visible density of new growth. The 1885 trees were in the ground, still small, still needing the collars, but planted and alive and organized into the logic of something larger. "I didn't come up here before," Silas said, still looking across the planting. "I know." He was quiet for a long time with the occupied quality that was still his characteristic response to things that required genuine reconsideration. A pair of birds moved through the old tree canopy above them, their sound carrying clear in the spring air. "My father used to say this whole valley was better than people gave it credit for." The sentence came out the way things come out when they have been held for a while and are finally ready to be released. He wasn't talking about the cattle ground. I understand that now. She looked at him. The winter had added something to his face that had not been there in the autumn. Not age exactly, but the texture of age, the way a long season settles into a person and shows itself afterward in small economies of movement and expression. He had not come to the slope to be gracious. He had come because something in him had required that he see it for himself before he could finish a piece of thinking he had been working on for a long time. "You told me there was nothing here worth saving," she said, not as an accusation, as a reference point. He met her eyes with the directness that had always been his most reliable quality. "I told you what 3 failed owners and 40 years of looking at that hillside from the road had taught me." His voice was level. "I was wrong about what those things meant." The acknowledgement cost him something. She could see that it did, not in distress, but in the specific weight that honest reconsideration carries when the person doing it has held the original position for a very long time. She did not make anything of it. She simply received it for what it was. "Come see the trees," she said, and led him up to the old grove. He walked through the 9 old trees slowly, his hand going to the bark of each one the way hers had gone to the first one in January of 1882, reading texture, reading structure, reading the accumulated evidence of survival. At the tree Callaway had identified, the one with the dense new growth, he stopped and looked up through the canopy for a long moment. "It's going to bear this season," she said. "Not much, but something." He looked at the branch structure above him and nodded slowly, not at her but at the tree itself. "First thing to fruit on that hillside in 20 years, he said. "More than that, probably." The records at the county office show the property last produced commercially in 1861. He looked down at that. Something moved across his expression that she did not try to name. 24 years. A thing that had survived in the dark under vines for 24 years was standing above them in the April light, putting out fruit, doing what it had always been capable of doing. "You did this," he said. She shook her head. "The tree did this." I cleared the ground and stepped back. He looked at her for a moment, with the full, direct attention he rarely gave anything except situations requiring a decision. Then he looked back at the tree. "That's not a small distinction," he said quietly. "Most people don't know the difference." They walked back down the slope together in the easy silence that had replaced the wary distance of their first years, and at the lower gate he collected his hat from the fence post where he had left it and put it on and looked back up the hillside once more. "I'll tell Alderman to come look at the east paddock again," he said. "He's been thinking about expanding his contract, and I believe he's ready to commit to it." She thanked him. He walked back toward the county road at his slower winter pace, and she stood at the gate watching him go with the understanding that some distances close, so gradually you only recognize them as closed. In the moment you look back and realize the ground between is gone. The tree Calloway had identified produced that summer with a modesty appropriate to its circumstances. 160 pounds of pecans, gathered over 2 October mornings into clean canvas bags. She handled each bag with a formality that would have seemed disproportionate to an observer who did not know what they represented. She brought a bag of the shelled nuts into Dalton and left them with Pruitt. The report came back 2 weeks later. Exceptional flavor profile, high oil content, specific aromatic quality consistent with mountain elevation provenance. The buyer's price offer for product of this quality and volume, when it reached commercial scale, was written at the bottom in a different hand. She read the number. It was not the number itself that required time. It was what the number meant about everything that had been required to arrive at a position where this number was being offered. The 11 years in Savannah, the auction room, the winter in a camper with a leaking roof, the night in the rain looking for goats, the February morning outside the commercial bank, the 3 dead trees in the drought, the 11 lost to frost, and the constant grinding work of building something that compounded rather than simply returned. She wrote back to the Chattanooga address Pruitt had given her, confirming her interest in a supply relationship and providing her production timeline with the same qualifications Calloway had originally attached to them, because she had learned that the most durable business relationships are built on accurate information rather than favorable approximations. The response came within a week. The buyer, a man named George Aldrich, wanted a first-right agreement on her production for 5 years when volume reached commercial threshold. He offered favorable terms. She read them twice, made 3 notations in the margin about language she wanted adjusted, and hired a Dalton attorney named Prescott to review the document before she signed anything. Prescott made the adjustments she had specified, plus 2 she had not considered. The final agreement was signed in December of 1885 and represented the first formal commercial commitment the operation had produced. She put the signed document in the tin box she kept under the camper bunk with the deed, the soil survey, and the hand-drawn map. The box was getting full. In the autumn of 1886, 2 of the remaining old trees produced alongside the first one. The combined harvest from the 3 was 430 pounds. Not a single event, but the beginning of a pattern. She filled 8 canvas bags and brought them to Pruitt, who verified the quality and logged them against the Aldrich agreement, and sent her a payment that was the first money she had received that came directly from the ground, rather than from the management of other people's ground. Dorothea Greer came up to the property that October, not for a professional visit, but for the first time without a specific declared purpose, which Willa took as its own kind of indicator. They walked the orchard together in the early evening, the light going golden horizontal through the trees, the air carrying the specific smell of a pecan orchard in October, something between green and sweet and earthy, a smell that Willa had come to associate with a particular quality of patience rewarded. Dorothea looked at the growth on the 1884 trees, now in their 3rd season, approaching the point where the protective collars were becoming unnecessary. She looked at the 1885 trees, solid in their 2nd season. She looked at the 1886 spring planting, 140 trees, the largest single planting yet, running along the east section where Corbin had helped extend the irrigation line. "When did you stop counting the trees by planting year?" Dorothea asked, "and start seeing them as one thing?" Willa considered the question honestly. "This spring, I think. Something about the way the canopy lines connected in April." She looked across the slope. It started looking like what it's supposed to become. Dorothea walked in silence for a moment. "I want to expand what we hold in reserve for you at the nursery. We've been basing it on your stated order each year. I think we should be holding more ahead of your stated order, based on what I'm seeing here." She stopped at the edge of the 1886 planting. "You're going to want to plant faster than you're currently planning." This was the most forward-looking statement Dorothea had made in 5 years of working together, and it was not the kind of statement she made without reason. "What are you seeing?" Willa asked. "I'm seeing ground that's been properly prepared that still has capacity. I'm seeing an operation that's managing more trees than it was able to manage 2 years ago, without proportional increases in labor." She looked at Willa directly. "I'm seeing something that's past the part where you have to wonder whether it will survive." It was the closest thing to reassurance that Dorothea Greer was constitutionally capable of offering, and Willa received it for exactly what it was. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was the winter in which the operation passed a threshold she had been working toward Since the February morning she had stood outside the commercial bank with her rejected loan application. The grazing contracts, the goat breeding sales, the young orchards beginning production, and the advancing establishment of the old trees had combined into something that no longer required her to spend the winter rearranging margins to find room for the next necessity. She was not comfortable by any standard that would have made sense in Savannah. She was stable in a way that allowed her to make plans that were not contingency plans. She spent that winter designing the processing facility. She worked from catalogs and from letters to equipment suppliers in Atlanta, from conversations with Callaway about what post-harvest handling would best preserve the quality characteristics that had attracted Aldrich buyers. From her own reading about cleaning and drying and sorting and packaging, she designed a building that was entirely functional. No space that did not serve a purpose, no equipment selected for appearance rather than reliability, no feature she could not justify on the basis of what it would do for the product or the efficiency of the work. She hired a builder named Garrett from Dalton, a compact man in his 40s who had built 3 structures in the county that she had been inside and found well made. She showed him her drawings and specifications and told him what she needed and what she did not need, which was a longer list. Garrett made 2 suggestions that improved the design and accepted her position on 4 other things she had decided and did not want to reconsider. The building went up over 6 weeks in the spring of 1888, and when it was finished, it was what she had designed: plain, tight, practical, oriented on the slope, to take advantage of natural air circulation through the drying space, with the cleaning and sorting area positioned to receive natural light from the north through windows that would not create heat problems in late summer. It looked like what it was. That was sufficient. The old trees produced that summer, as though the previous seasons had been a rehearsal. 5 of the 9 contributed meaningfully to the harvest, and the combined yield that autumn. Old trees in the first cohort of 1884 trees, now in their 5th season and beginning their first real production, totaled just over 2,000 pounds of processed pecans, packed into clean bags and transported to Dalton for shipment to Chattanooga under the Aldrich Agreement. She stood in the processing building on the evening of the last shipment day with the clean, empty space around her and the smell of fresh pecan in the air and the sound of Corbin outside unhitching the wagon. The ledger she had brought in to record the final weights was open on the work table, and the number written at the bottom of the page was the kind of number that meant something different had arrived. Not the end of the work, not the completion of what she had set out to build. The work ahead of her was larger than the work behind her. More trees to plant, more ground to bring in, more seasons of management and adjustment, and the patient repetition that this kind of building required. But the number in the ledger meant that the foundation had been established, that what she was doing was no longer a project dependent on sustaining the will to continue against evidence that was still ambiguous. The evidence was no longer ambiguous. She closed the ledger and walked out into the October evening. The years that followed moved at the pace of the orchard itself, measured not in months but in growing seasons, in the gradual thickening of trunks and the annual extension of canopy, in harvests that grew from 2,000 pounds to 4,000 to 7,000 as the 1884 cohort reached full production, and the 1885 and 1886 plantings began contributing meaningfully to the total. She added new planting sections as reclaimed ground became available, always following the discipline she had established at the beginning. Prepare the soil first, improve drainage, address the pH, install irrigation, and then plant. Never before. Corbin grew from a 17-year-old learning the work to a man in his middle 20s who knew the Voss Ridge herd better than anyone except Willa herself. She gave him full management responsibility for the grazing contracts in 1891, which freed her to spend more time in the orchard and less time on the roads between other people's properties. The grazing service had by then established itself sufficiently that its reputation required less of her direct presence to maintain. Dorothea continued holding the strongest grafted stock in reserve for Voss Ridge Farm each year. They met each winter to plan the following season's planting. 2 women at a table in Dalton going over varieties and rootstock inventories with the focused efficiency of people who had been working together long enough to have developed a shared language. Shorthand for problems they had solved before. A mutual understanding of what the other's concerns were before they were fully stated. The relationship had moved over the years from mutual utility to something closer to partnership, without either of them having explicitly proposed the transition. Silas Drummond came to the North Slope every spring after that first visit in 1885. He came alone, on foot, usually on a weekday morning, when he had told no one where he was going. He would stand at the upper fence line for a while, looking out at whatever was new. The 1889 planting establishing itself along the west slope, the 1892 expansion into the cleared ground below the old drainage channels, the growing canopy of the 1884 trees that by the early 1890s had begun to form a connected roof of green across the upper hillside. He rarely stayed long. He and Willa exchanged a few words about what was visible, what had changed, what was coming, and then he would put his hat back on and walk back down the slope to wherever he had left his horse. In 1893, standing with her under the sixth old tree on a morning in late April, when the orchard was in its fullest spring flush, and the new growth was so dense in the canopy above them that the light coming through it was almost green, he said something she had not expected from him. "My father's generation lost a great deal of land to people who didn't know how to read it," he said. He was looking up through the canopy, the way he had been looking at these trees for 8 years now. They sold it because they couldn't make it produce. They sold it for what it looked like, not what it was. She waited. This was more than he usually offered in the way of direct statement, and she had learned that interrupting Silas Drummond's rare long sentences was a way of not getting to hear the end of them. "You read it right," he said, "before you bought it. Before anyone else thought there was anything here to read." He brought his gaze down from the canopy and looked at her directly. "I want you to know I understand that now. Not the farming, the reading." It was the most complete acknowledgement he had ever made, and it arrived 12 years after the courthouse steps, where he had walked away without another word, after she said she would recover the property with goats. She did not make a ceremony of receiving it. She simply nodded, the way he nodded at things that required acknowledgement without elaboration, and they stood for another moment under the old tree while the spring light moved through the leaves above them. He died in the spring of 1902, at 84 years old. In the same county his family had worked for 3 generations. Willa learned of it from one of the drainage workers, now a man in his 40s, who came by the farm to tell her before she might hear it from someone else. She thanked him and went back to her pruning work and did not speak of it to anyone else that day. That evening she walked up to the old grove alone, in the April dusk, and stood for a long time under the largest of the 9 trees without doing anything particular. Not grieving, exactly. Recognizing the specific weight of the absence of someone who had watched you from the beginning and had, over many years, slowly revised his estimation of what he had been watching. The processing facility expanded twice in the 1890s as the harvest volume required it. Both expansions followed the same principle as the original building: functional first, no space without purpose, equipment chosen for durability rather than appearance. By the mid-1890s, the facility employed 6 workers through the harvest months and 2 year-round, which made Voss Ridge Farm one of the more significant employers of seasonal labor in Tilton County. She built a small market stand at the road entrance to the property in 1896, initially as a way to sell directly the portions of each harvest that did not meet the specifications of the Aldrich contract: the smaller nuts, the irregular shapes, the splits. Local buyers came first, then buyers from Dalton. Then, as word spread in the particular way that word spreads about a place that produces something genuinely distinctive, buyers from further away began making the mountain road trip deliberately in October to purchase fresh pecans from a farm they had heard about from someone who had been there the previous year. She added items from neighboring farms over the following seasons: local honey, dried herbs, preserves made from the wild fruit that still grew along the creek bottoms at the lower margin of the property, and invited the producers of those items to sell alongside her rather than through her, because she did not want a margin on other people's work, and because she understood that a destination with more reasons to visit was a stronger destination than one with only a single reason. This was applied banking logic in a form her former colleagues in Savannah would not have recognized as banking logic, but it was the same reasoning, applied to a different kind of account. Josephine Hale arrived at Voss Ridge Farm on a Wednesday morning in October of 1901, on assignment from the Georgia Agricultural Review, which had been publishing a series of profiles on successful farm operations across the mountain counties. She was 28 years old, with dark hair cut practically short, and the deliberate, observant manner of someone who had grown up listening carefully because it was more instructive than talking. She had been raised on a small dairy farm in the northern part of the state and had studied journalism because she wanted rural stories documented by people who understood what they were documenting, rather than by people to whom the countryside was a subject rather than a place. She spent the morning with Willa, walking the orchard, listening more than asking, making the kind of spare notes that suggested she was recording what she would need later, rather than trying to write the article in real time. They walked through the 1884 trees, which were by then in their 17th growing season and had long since ceased to be young trees in any meaningful sense. They were orchard trees, mature, productive, their canopies creating the familiar architecture of a working grove. They walked through the sections planted in the late 1880s and the early 1890s, each cohort visible by its size and the character of its bark, the annual rings of the expansion readable in the landscape the way growth rings are readable in cross-section. They came last to the 9 old trees at the upper margin of the original planting area. Willa had always maintained a small cleared space around each of them, not the managed geometry of the commercial planting rows, but something more like the space you give a person who has been standing in place for a long time and has earned a certain radius of their own. Josephine stood for a while looking at the largest of the 9, the one she had first touched in January of 1882 in the dark with the oil lamp flickering in the January wind. The tree was fully itself now in a way that it had not been even 10 years ago, the canopy dense and broad, the trunk's furrows deepened by 2 more decades of growth, the root flare at the base of the trunk visible as a complex anchored form beneath the leaf litter. "How old do you think they are?" Josephine asked. "Callaway estimated 60 years when he examined them in 1882, Willa said. "That would make the oldest of them close to 80 now." Josephine made a note. Then she asked the question she had apparently been building toward all morning. "When you look at what this farm has become, which decision do you think made the most difference?" Willa considered the question the way she considered all questions that deserved more than a quick answer, by taking the time actually required, regardless of whether that time was comfortable for the person who had asked. "Not a decision," she said at last. "A change in what I was trying to do." She looked at the old tree beside them. "I came here to remove what was covering the land. At some point I stopped thinking about removing things and started thinking about what to build in the space that removing things created. Those are different projects, and only one of them has a completion." Josephine lowered her notebook. "When did that change happen?" Willa looked at the tree for a long moment. "The night I understood these trees had been here the entire time," she said, "not waiting for me, just continuing. I realized the most important thing I could do was make sure something I planted would do the same. Continue, after I was no longer here to tend it." The article appeared in the November 1901 issue of the Georgia Agricultural Review. It was thorough and accurate and treated the farm and the woman who had built it with the specific respect of a writer who understood what she was writing about. Willa read it once when it arrived, folded it, and put it in the tin box under the bunk, with the deed and the soil survey and the hand-drawn map and the Aldrich contract and the letter from Dorothea about the frost. The box had required a second one alongside it for several years now, and the second box was itself beginning to fill. She did not read the article again. She did not need to. The record she kept of what the farm had been and what it had become was written in the land itself. In the 18-inch oak fence posts at the corners of the east paddock, in the drainage channels running correctly down the north slope, in the hawthorn hedgerow along the northeast margin that had long since grown to its intended density, in the processing building's clean interior and the market stand's wide porch and the rows of trees stretching across what had been 20 years earlier an impenetrable wall of bramble and muscadine. The autumn of 1905 arrived the way the best autumns arrive in the Cohutta Mountains, unhurried clear, with a quality of light that has something final in it without being somber about it. The kind of light that makes you stop what you are doing and look at the landscape around you because the landscape is doing something worth looking at. Willa Voss was 59 years old. Her chestnut hair had gone largely silver, though she still wore it in the same practical knot she had worn at the courthouse in October of 1881. Her hands were the hands of a person who had spent 24 years doing physical work outdoors, marked by weather and labor in ways that were legible and that she had long since stopped thinking about. The way you stop thinking about anything that is simply your own. She was not the same person who had stood at the back of that auction room. She was the person that standing there had eventually made her, through the particular process of becoming that happens when you commit to something long enough for it to commit back. The farm was, by any measure available in Tilton County in 1905, a success. The orchard covered the better part of 100 acres, planted in the patient increments she had maintained from the beginning, the earliest trees now mature enough that they had begun to produce at the upper end of Callaway's original projections. The Aldrich relationship had been renegotiated twice since the first agreement, each time on terms that reflected the demonstrated quality and consistency of the product. And there was a second buyer relationship now with a supplier in Atlanta whose customers had particular interest in the mountain elevation flavor characteristics that Pruitt had identified as significant more than 20 years earlier. The goats were still present on the property in smaller numbers than the peak years of the grazing service business, managed now primarily to keep the outer margins of the orchard clear and to handle new invasive growth in the sections that had not yet been planted. Corbin managed the herd, the grazing contracts. Reduced now to a handful of long-standing client relationships he maintained largely on his own, and the day-to-day operations of the farm, consulting with Willa on the decisions that warranted consultation and handling the rest himself. He was 38 years old and had spent more than half his life working this land. On a morning in early October, when the first color was just coming into the oaks on the ridge and the air had the particular sharpness that follows the first cold night of autumn, Willa walked up to the old grove before breakfast. She did this occasionally now, not as part of her regular rounds. Corbin handled those, but as a particular kind of visit that had no practical purpose and required no justification. She went because the old trees were there, and because going to see them was something she had been doing, in one form or another, for nearly a quarter-century. And some habits become, over time, less habits than they are part of the structure of a life. The 9 trees stood as they had always stood, in their irregular line across the upper slope, unchanged in the ways that mattered and changed in the ways that years change anything. Taller now, their canopies broader, the furrows in the oldest bark deep into something that read, up close, like topographic maps of the decades. She had protected them each year from the commercial harvest pressure that the newer trees absorbed without difficulty, had managed them according to their own particular needs rather than the needs of the operation, had done for them what she understood now was simply the continuation of what their original planter had done, given them conditions in which to be what they were already going to be. She did not know who had planted them. She had never learned. The county records told her only the sequence of ownership before the property was abandoned to back taxes and invasive growth. And nothing in those records named the person who had established the grove sometime around 1840 or 1845, who had selected the location on the north slope for its drainage and its mineral richness, who had committed to the long waiting period that pecan production requires and had understood that the commitment extended beyond any single lifespan. She thought about this sometimes, standing among the trees. The person who planted them had not seen them reach the size they were when Willa found them in the January dark of 1882. Whatever had happened between the planting and the abandonment, the trees had outlasted the circumstances of their origin and had continued, in the dark under the vines, entirely without assistance, for 24 years. They had not survived because conditions favored them. They had survived because the roots went deep enough that the conditions on the surface were not the whole story. She had tried to build the rest of the orchard on the same principle. The October morning was advancing, the light strengthening as it climbed above the ridge. Below her, the orchard spread down the hillsides in the long rows she had established year by year, planting year cohort by planting year cohort, each addition visible in the slightly different trunk diameter and canopy density if you knew what you were looking at. She could walk through it and read it like a record of the decisions she had made across 2 decades, where she had gotten the drainage right in the first attempt and where she had had to correct it, where the variety selection had worked exactly as intended, and where she had made a different choice the following season, where the hawthorn hedgerow had done exactly what she had needed it to do for 20 years. On the ground at the base of the oldest tree, a pecan had fallen overnight, one of the season's first, dislodged by the cold or by the small wind that moved through the canopy in the early morning hours. She crouched and picked it up. It sat in her palm with the specific weight of something that had been all summer accumulating into itself, drawing from the deep mineral soil and the mountain moisture and the particular quality of light that came at this elevation, through these long-growing seasons, becoming what it was going to become with no awareness of the time the process required. She held it for a moment, turning it between her fingers, thinking about the tin box under the bunk, where the deed still sat alongside everything else. The hand-drawn map, the soil survey from 1859, the Aldrich contract, Dorothea's letter, the article from the Review, all the paper record of what this farm had been and what it had taken to bring it to this morning. The map, most of all, the one she had found behind the soil notes in the wrong folder in the county clerk's office in October of 1881, the one whose notation had told her before she had bought the land that someone else had understood what this slope could hold. Pecan Grove, North Slope established. She closed her fingers around the nut and stood up from the ground and looked out across the orchard she had built on ground that someone else had prepared, in a direction she had been pointed toward by a map drawn by a hand she would never know. The morning light was full across the hillside now, catching the yellow-green of the October canopy and the darker color of the old trees and the particular silver of the hawthorn hedgerow at the northeast margin and the weathered wood of the processing building's roof visible below, and further down, the road to Dalton winding through the valley where 24 years earlier she had stood on courthouse steps, while a room full of men laughed at a woman who had paid $1,200 for a pile of vines. She walked down through the orchard, checking trees the way she had been checking trees since the first small cohort went into the ground in 1884, looking at new growth, looking at bark condition, noticing the things that Corbin's morning rounds would also notice, and recording her own observations separately, because 2 careful records of the same ground produced a more complete picture than one. At the lower margin of the 1884 section, she stopped and looked at one of the original trees from that first planting, now in its 22nd growing season, its trunk diameter the width of a strong man's forearm, its canopy filling the space Callaway had specified for it, and touching, on its western side, the canopy of its neighbor. She had planted this tree. She had carried it from the wagon to the stake and put it in the ground herself. On the third day of the planting, when her hands were raw from the work and the April cold, and she was tired in the particular way of someone who has been doing careful, physical work for 3 consecutive days and is not yet done. She had placed the collar around its trunk and watered it in and moved to the next stake. She had not known then what it would become, except in the abstract sense of having read Callaway's projections and trusted them. She knew it now by standing beside it and looking at what was there. She put her hand on the bark the way she had put her hand on the bark of the old trees in January of 1882. In the January dark, on the first night she understood the north slope was going to change everything she thought she was building. The bark of this tree was different from the old trees, smoother, younger, but beginning to develop the first suggestions of the furrows that the old trees carried so deeply. In 40 years it would look like them. In 60 years it might look like the oldest of the 9, the one whose bark read like topography. She would not be here to see that. She had understood this for a long time and understood it the same way she understood most things that could not be changed. Practically, without prolonged feeling about it, as one of the terms of the arrangement. She had accepted those terms the same way she had accepted the other terms. Not happily, not unhappily, but without illusion. The point was not to see it. The point was to make sure that whatever she planted was the kind of thing worth seeing. She took the nut she had been carrying since the old grove, the one that had fallen overnight from the oldest tree on the property, and she crouched at the root base of the 1884 tree and pressed it into the soil beside the root flare. Not deeply, not with any particular intention of successful germination. Simply as a gesture that had meaning to her in the private way that gestures sometimes do, without requiring explanation or audience. The nut went into the dark soil and she covered it with a handful of leaf litter and stood up and dusted her hands against her coat. She walked the rest of the orchard. She made her notes. She checked in with Corbin at the processing building, where the season's first shipment was being prepared for transport to Dalton. And she went over the weights with him and confirmed the quality grades and reviewed the ship schedule. She drank the cup of coffee he had made without being asked, because over 21 years of working together, some things had become simply part of the rhythm of the work, requiring no instruction and no comment. At mid-morning, she walked out to the road entrance and checked on the market stand, which Corbin's wife and her sister staffed through the harvest season. 3 families from Dalton were browsing the tables when Willa arrived, and she spoke with them briefly and answered their questions about the trees and the harvest, and whether the flavor was different from what they had bought the previous year. It was slightly, because the late summer rain had been distributed differently, and the mineral uptake from the soil had reflected that in ways the most attentive buyers could detect, and she watched them make their selections and leave with the particular satisfaction of people who have come a distance to get something specific and found exactly what they came for. In the afternoon, she sat at the table in the farm office. The camper was long gone, replaced years ago by a small building she had constructed beside the original barn, which itself had been re-sided and re-roofed and now served as storage for equipment that was still useful and did not require the temperature-controlled environment of the processing facility. And she wrote the month's accounts in the ledger with the same care she had brought to every set of accounts she had ever kept, going back to the accounts she had kept for other people's money in the counting rooms of Savannah. The numbers in the ledger were the numbers of a farm that had been built the way she had intended to build it from the beginning, which was slowly, in stages, each stage funded by what the previous stage had produced, without borrowing against futures that had not yet arrived. They were not the numbers of a wealthy woman, by the standards of people in Savannah, who had known her when she worked at the Second Savannah Bank of Commerce. They were the numbers of a woman who owned something outright, who owed nothing against it, and whose ownership had been earned across 24 years of work in a way that made the ownership different in character from ownership that arrives by any faster means. She closed the ledger. She put it in the desk drawer beside the second tin box. She looked out the office window at the orchard on the hillside, which had been visible from this window since she built the office, and which she had looked at from this window on thousands of mornings and evenings across the years, and which looked, on this October morning in 1905, like what it had always been becoming. Not finished, because an orchard is never finished, but present, fully itself, doing what it was built to do. She had a letter to write to Dorothea about next spring's planting order, and she had a response to send to a buyer in Augusta, who had written in September asking about the possibility of a supply relationship beginning with the 1906 harvest, and she had a conversation to have with Corbin about whether the northwest section of the property, the last significant area that had not yet been planted, was ready to receive trees in the spring of 1906, or whether it needed another season of preparation. She would do all of these things. She would do them with the same attention she had brought to every decision on this property since October of 1881, because the attention was the work, and the work was what she had come here to do. And the fact that she had been doing it for 24 years did not mean it was finished. It meant she had been at it long enough to understand that the point was not to finish. The point was to build something that would outlast the building of it, so that the work itself continued in the things it had produced. The way the work of the person who planted the old trees had continued in the trees themselves, through 24 years of darkness and vines, until a woman with a lamp found her hand against bark that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for someone patient enough to clear the ground. The afternoon light was moving across the hillside the way it moves in the mountains in October, low and warm and particular, lasting longer than you expect it to, and then going all at once. Willa picked up her pen and began the letter to Dorothea.